I think we're going to shift over into kind of another topic related to the
Hmm.
government's ability to seize individuals' property or sometimes individuals themselves, and connect it to some news we've heard. So, Alex, why don't you shift us over into what's going on in Canada and the talks around First Nations peoples and the reactions there?
Absolutely, man. And I think it's a really good segue, an unfortunate segue and a tragic segue, but very important. So basically, just to summarize, between 1830 and 1998, so literally 23 years ago, the Canadian government and churches basically took close to 200,000 Native children from the First Peoples, as they call them, and they took them from their parents and confined them to boarding schools that they weren't teaching kids to think for themselves and do their own thing or learn and live. They were teaching kids drop your Indigenous heritage, learn English, subscribe to the indoctrination of the Catholic Church, and move forward. And we'll get into this later, but Canada actually over the last decade has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked into some of these atrocities, and they said what happened over the last 150 years was a cultural genocide, and it is. And just the last thing I'll say is that over the last month, they have found a shit ton, excuse my language, of mass graves around Canada, in Vancouver to Calgary to the center parts of the country, and they found a lot of dead kids that have never been named, have never been given any hope, that all died in these damn schools. And there's talks of suicide. Kids were told you cannot speak your native language or you'll be beat. And there's a lot of just depression amongst these people, and some of it was suicide. Also, like diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis ravaged a lot of them, and these kids were just buried without any reconciliation or just dialogue with these families, Drew. And I think it's a broader conversation because the U.S. is definitely not different from this. But now we're seeing churches burning, and that was a great article you shared. But we're just seeing kind of a anger in Canada around this, and a rightful anger. But now the next question is, how do you reconcile with your past and also move forward?
Yeah, right. So this is a topic that has been talked about in the United States and Canada before, um, especially in academic circles. Hopefully, not enough in the lower education and public education, in my opinion. But in academic circles, this is a conversation that happens a lot. These boarding schools where Native Americans in America or Canada, or in Canada, they're sometimes called First Nations peoples, but Native Americans were forcibly removed from their families and put in these schools to basically reprogram them to become more European culture, basically be more white, sometimes physically bleaching skin, cutting hair, preventing them from speaking any native languages, forcing them to wear European style clothes, forcing them to convert to the religion. In Canada's case, Catholicism. Often in the U.S. case, Christianity of many types. But it was basically a re-education program for kids and so sometimes they were given up by parents. Oftentimes they were taken from parents, not given updates, right? And so this is not new news to people. This is something that's we've known has been going on. The reason it's flared up again is because a study was done in Canada to look at some of the deeper effects of these schools in Canada, and they uncovered what Alex was saying, these graves. So, I think it was somewhere up 731 unmarked graves in Saskatoon, 200 and something graves at one other site. Like we're talking hundreds, if not thousands, of unmarked graves. And what that means is that does not necessarily mean. And this is where you have to be really careful about when you're reading the reporting and the language used. Is what that means is that doesn't mean that they were just like executing kids. What it probably means is a lot of kids died of diseases, or suicide, depression, or like hunger strikes. But my guess is mostly diseases. Is and why that's not just a guess is I've actually looked at here is we have I I think I had voices. There it is. Voices from boarding schools. Direct quotes from superintendents, teachers, students, and Supreme Courts, especially from the Secretary of the Interior. Now, this is more the U.S. boarding schools, but just looking at the type of activities that happen there, which are very similar to those in Canada, we can see that. I see one here. They said like in one year they're like we had 200 kids. No, here it is. So we had 200 pupils last year, and only 6 died. Only 6. And that's a good year. They're like the health of the scholars was generally good. Only 6 died. This school averaged a fraction over 200 people. Yeah, representing 29 tribes. So I mean, so 6 out of 100, right? That's 3-4% chance your kid's gonna die, just in any year, just in 1 year. I mean, imagine if you sent your kid to a preschool where they had 200 kids. And you're like, don't worry, we did pretty good last year. Like only 6 kids died. But that's the idea. So just so we understand what we're talking about, we're not talking about Catholic priests like executing Indian kids. We're talking about them attempting at re-educating them into Catholic culture. Now that's not good at all. I think that should be a good thing, and we'll get into a lot of reasons why. But just so we're clear on what these mass graves were, and they also think that they were at one point marked with probably wooden crosses that had deteriorated. So just to give that a little bit more context. But what I want to be clear though is it was not nice. From what we have is again 11 deaths among our 400 students this year. 4 from tuberculosis, 1 from tubercular epilepsy, 1 from dropsy, another from chronic malaria, and 1 from suicide. Right? That's in Pennsylvania, 1886. They talk about how there is one here that's pretty. Here it is: kill the Indian, save the man. Transfer the savage-born infant into the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit. All right, so it was very clear that this was to kill, literally to steal the young generation of Indians, to kill off any cultural ties they had to their ancestors, and to basically say, you now have to act white. And I don't know. That's so messed up. And it's amazing that I looked here in the New York Post. This person, Kelly Jane Torrance, who does correctly criticize media at not understanding what the mass graves were, because some media was reporting it as like a Nazi killing Jews in a mass grave, which is very different. But she totally misses the mark. And I hear this all the time from the right wing, where she says it's a terrible thing that these children died. It's a terrible thing of what they that we need to reconcile with all this, but she did say, but most priests were well intentioned and they were just trying to save them into Christianity. And I think that really, and I'm trying to find the exact quote here. Anyone wants to really quote this can. It's New York Post, Kelly Jane Torrance. But there's one part in here. Yeah, most of the teachers, nuns, and priests in charge were well-meaning, though, as in any group, some bad apples took advantage of their positions to inflict abuse. The idea was to turn poverty-stricken children into productive, even prosperous members of mainstream Canadian society, and from the church's perspective, to save their souls. So, like, you can tell the way she's talking, she kind of still has that idea in her head. Like, well, the idea was a good one. And I say no, the original idea was not a good one. It was to literally kill a culture that they deemed undesirable and lesser than themselves.
Yes, okay. So, first things first. What blows my mind about this is that what the Catholic Church, and I honestly, like, I'm not even putting blame specifically on the Catholic Church at this point, even though there's definitely blame to be put there. It's more that I'm surprised that even up to 1998, we are seeing similar conversion tactics, that the conquistadors used in the 1490s. Like, to me, just like, that's my first takeaway here, is that not a lot has changed in how a lot of European Western culture is dealing with the indigenous. It's basically like, if we just force them to read English, speak English, and learn about our history, their culture will go out the door. I think any sociologist, any historian, any person with a brain could understand that you can't just take the fight out of a dog because you tell the dog it can't fight anymore. And it's... I understand that was probably not the best one to say, like, fight a dog, blah blah blah. But you get what I mean, right? Is that like it's really hard to take like the culture out of somebody just by forcing them to do something they don't want to do. And I'm just surprised that the Catholic Church has never understood that this tactic doesn't work. A country, especially a Western democracy, functions on differences. And it just alarms me. Like, I listened to the New York Times Daily where they had a guy, Ken Thomas, who was an indigenous man who went to one of these schools. He was just taken in a van at age 6, and he was taken to the Muscowacan Indian Residential School. I really apologize for the pronunciation, but he basically talks about how the nuns immediately shaved his braids, told him he would be punished if he spoke in his native language, and he mentions that in the first week, a classmate committed suicide after trying to escape. They were locked in a classroom. And he also talked about contractors when he was there were just digging up bones left and right. And like the sad thing is it's like damned if I do, damned if I don't. Like the people who stood up for their indigenous culture were beaten, locked up, basically treated like prisoners, and I could imagine that would lead to a lot of suicidal tendencies. And the people that went along also might have got tuberculosis because let's be honest, like the book 1491, people should read. It talks about how like a lot of the Americas just had never been exposed to these diseases. They also just had a different genetic makeup over like, millennia of being separated from the European evolution of people. Like people are different. Around the world you're exposed to different diseases. And so if you put a bunch of kids in a school together and there's going to be some serious diseases going out of there. And I just wish someone had the foresight to deal with that. And it really breaks my heart because this Truth and Reconciliation Commission out of Canada, they estimated that about 4,100 children vanished from these schools, but those numbers do seem to be higher. Now, Drew, on that New York Post thing, which I just wanted to touch on really quick, is that article is flawed in so many ways. There's like a few paragraphs I agree with, but it to me seems like this is a weird parallel I'm going to bring up here. Is that it seems like a lot like the George Floyd killing, and just hear me out here. Is that like a lot of like the New York Post and a lot of the Republicans who would probably read the New York Post were like, yes, it was horrible. George Floyd shouldn't have died. But is always the key term in some of these, is that, but like, what were they doing? Like, what was the background behind this? Like, it was only like a few bad apples who did this, but the system isn't rotten. And to me, it seems like the same thing happened here. Is that okay? Yes, there are people burning churches in Canada, and like I think that's something interesting to talk about. Like, I don't agree with that. Like, I don't think burning Catholic churches throughout Canada is going to solve the problem. It's kind of the eye for the eye thing,
Yes.
And I do agree with the point is that some of the protests over last summer were not looked at as the same as the anti-mask protests in Michigan. Like stuff like that. Like I think like sometimes the media focuses on these justice issues, and maybe rightfully so. But like for the New York Times or the New York Post, excuse me, just to be like, yeah, there were some bad apples. That's not the narrative I'm seeing. And I think that article shows like a lot of kind of the reason why we should teach critical race theory in some ways in schools. And I know that's weird for me to say right here is like we need to teach people about our history. And I think we're seeing some of the fallout of not teaching people about an accurate history right here because now we have different narratives. Like there were some good, there were some bad, like we had to do this, blah, blah, blah. It's like if we could just focus on teaching a non-biased history of our nation, maybe these things wouldn't be like spurring up every time.
Right. Well, it is worth mentioning that the arson, as we know, like we don't know all the suspects for these arsons. The Catholic Church. It doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean they are automatically native peoples, right? There have been countless native leaders that have denounced the church burnings, but of course still want to hold the government accountable and are talking about ways for social justice and things. It does mention here in this New York Post article that almost 2/3 of Canada's natives are Christian, 57% of those are Catholic, right? This is now. I mean, why do you think that is? I don't know. Maybe because the government engaged in a massive cultural reprogramming thing. Just like I don't know, but no. So, but yes. So I agree with you that burning down Catholic churches is not going to solve any issues. But it's also unwise to ignore why people are angry at this. Maybe there is some wounds that are left unhealed, and I would say that there are. I think that Indian country, which is kind of the term for like Native people's rights in the Americas and as a whole. It could be from Central America to Canada. There's just people call Indian country. Even some, it's kind of like in like saying like the black community. It'll be like, well, a lot of rumblings around this topic have gone through Indian country, and I think for Indian country as a whole, um, you know, there is a ton of topics that I think are stones that need to be turned over again. There's a lot of feeling of there hasn't been enough answers on some of these questions, or not nearly enough representation of our problems in government, whether it's Canada or the U.S. or other places I've been, like Costa Rica has problems with, and issues with native representation in there. So this is so this topic bubbled up again in Canada, but I guarantee you it will bubble up again in the United States and anywhere in the world where there has been an indigenous group that's been forcibly removed from what they used to know. Um, but super fascinating stuff, and again, not that it's exactly the same as eminent domain, but just that idea of like, we have to set boundaries on how much power a government does have over individuals, and this is a good example of where the government had way too much power to take children from their parents, have them die of tuberculosis, not tell the parents that happened. I mean, just insane stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's truly heartbreaking, and it's sadly something we see, which to me just is like the inherent nature of man. Sadly, is like you want people to look, talk, and believe what you believe, and it's like to me, like I love America. I love the United States. I really do. You know, I like the idea in a nutshell, and like I'm kind of turning this more into the United States than Canada for a second. But to me, it like I understand why in some ways there's always a backlash against learning about these tough events, because it seems like our country always wants to recognize past it, like doesn't want to like reconcile with past issues. Because I'm thinking out loud here, but it's like there's a percentage of Americans that feel by reconciling with our past, it's threatening their current image and narrative of their life. Like to now add some asterisks to the American dream, for example, I think it almost threatens some of those people's American dream. And I'm not defending that, but I think that's why there's an opposition by people, even this New York Times post, to try to like vindicate some of these nuns and priests by saying like there were some bad apples, but there were some good ones as well. And it's because like we have been fed a narrative for so long that like manifest destiny was a growth of our nation, and it was like the American, it was the fundamentals of American progress to keep growing, and you don't look at how we did that. You don't look at how we did that, and so it's like I feel like there's this like game of chicken in a way going on between people who really love this, the patriotic side, who are just like, I want to believe that what I'm doing is good, and then plus the actual history of how we got there. And I don't think we can ever reconcile with our past until we find a way to not only appease the people who are proud of their country, usually Eurocentric white Americans, and also how do we also talk about the indigenous problem and what happened to those people along the way in the same sentence without dividing and causing a culture war.
Well, I think just for the people that, I mean, I think it's just in general, I think people that are scared to learn about the past, or not like, I don't know,
No, it's tough.
learning about America's tough past makes me want to make the country better. It makes me want to be
Right.
more patriotic. I think for others, they're scared to, like you said, put an asterisk on the American dream. But that's an immature way to look at life. That's a
Absolutely.
that's a narrow-minded view on life in general. So I don't think we should appease those people. I think they should open their eyes.
No, and I totally agree. I just feel like we need to find some like line basically between like maybe not burn churches, because I
Well,
would
I'm
just
not. I'm
imagine.
not. Very
No, no, no.
little
I
people
know
are
you're not.
advocating for burning churches. Yeah.
No, no, I know what you mean, but I just feel like you have to find a line between the people who don't want to talk about the past because it has an asterisk to their like personal family legacy, and also dealing with the past. And like an eye for an eye either way is like I just like it kind of, I mean, we could have a whole other podcast on just the idea of reparations. But I think
Sure.
it goes into that is like how do you balance past and future with while keeping the present moment healthy? And I don't think like Canada and the United States specifically are doing well. Now the one thing I will say is that at least Canada has a reconciliation commission.
Hmm.
It's always surprised me that the US is never willing to do that, man. It really pisses me off.
Yeah, they're not even. Yeah, and you're right. So we'll have to see. I mean, so Trudeau has as Trudeau has officially condemned the arson, and you're right that they have that commission. So we'll have to see what happens. This is not, but just for those that are maybe are a little just like didn't know what this issue was. Hopefully, you now have a little bit more insight. And certainly, this issue is something that we see anywhere that there was the remnants of colonialism. These things bubble up, and that's why historyism matters. That's why things in the past do affect us today, and we need to look at that. But we need to look at it with some nuance, and this is certainly an issue with a lot of nuance because yeah, I don't want churches to be burned either, but they're being burned for a reason, and the reason is pretty grotesque. So, well, I guess we'll end that topic with that.